Welcome everyone to Startup Grind. As everyone knows, we're recording this session, so thank you for joining us, and thank you, Reggie, for joining us as well.
No problem.
The first virtual event we're having with the Startup Grind platform, and but we're excited to have everyone here, that we have everyone joining from around Switzerland. I had invited a few people from outside of Switzerland, but, and actually, Reggie, on my Twitter feed, we have Derek, who's the founder of Startup Grind, on a thread saying how excited he was to hear the FuckUp Nights in the house tonight. So
yeah, that's cool. That's really cool.
Yeah. Well, really good to have you, Reggie. I'm glad you could join us.
Hey, no problem.
Where are you right now?
I'm in Geneva.
Geneva. All right.
Yeah. Wait, let me just try to lower that. Let me just go check something for 1 second.
Right. The noise of home office and Corona and all of these lovely things coming together.
Sorry about that.
No.
Ambient noise. There it is. Yeah.
And then we get the cat videos in real life these days, huh?
Absolutely.
So, Reggie, we'd like to start off a bit with, understanding a little bit about who you are, where you come from. Most of the time we interview founders from Switzerland, since we're based here in Switzerland, and it's interesting to hear about the challenges that founders have faced in launching their businesses here. You have a little bit of a different background, and also the topic tonight is a little bit different, focusing a little bit more on the success and failures of entrepreneurs. So, where are you from?
So I'm based in Geneva. I grew up there most of my life. About 3/4 of my life I spent here, but I was born in the United States, in New York. Mm-hmm. Which is kind of like a blimp on my resume. I've never lived there. I went there on vacation, but I never really lived there. Some of my family is there, and I grew up in Canada, Montreal.
Okay.
So then, when I turned about 13, I moved here, and I did most of my studies and my entire professional life here. Which is rather standard, like a standard immigrant story. Now I'm Swiss.
Yeah.
I became Swiss about 10 years ago. And it's kind of funny when you say you start the story, you start the founder story with a little bit of their challenges. I mean, in a way, I was a failure guy for as long as I can remember, and I had like my fair share of failures or hardships as a business owner, founder.
Yeah. But so it's interesting. So you culturally you are Swiss.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think yeah. I can consider for a long time I was Genevois.
Right.
I think that was like, it's like kind of like coming from Zurich, right? Cities here and some cantons they're very entrenched in their own personal culture. Mm-hmm. But most cantons outside of Geneva are very Swiss, and in Geneva it's quite different. It's kind of like this sort of hub where you feel sometimes kind of detached to Switzerland.
Huh.
And then I dated a Swiss girl,
and
dating a Swiss girl who recognizes herself as Swiss, even though she's from Geneva and grew up there. Well, we start discovering our country. Mm-hmm. And then I think from that moment on, I really started appreciating like the culture and the other aspects beyond the fondue and beyond the chocolate and beyond, the usual suspects.
When you were growing up, did you have some ambition, or what did you have in mind about what you wanted to be when you grew up?
Yeah, that's a long that was a long journey, right? Because I had this thing where my dad used to work in the hotel business for like most of my life, and the only thing I would understand for what he does is that you went to work with a suit, right? So I was like, okay, if you're an important person, and you have all this imagery of like, it was the golden era of finance, and especially in North America. So you wear a suit, you're doing something important. So in my mind, I was like, okay, whatever I do, I need to wear a suit. And one of the first things I wanted to be was like a stockbroker, because I felt like that was the job. That was the thing. And then obviously you start your studies, you start uni, and then you start discovering jobs, and you're like, okay, that's not as sexy as it sounds. Regulations change, but I went from like finance to marketing. Like one of my biggest dreams when I was like 19 was either working in advertising or Procter and Gamble, because I thought it was like the marketing school of the world, right?
Yeah.
And I think nothing really kind of like set me off to do what I do now. Like now I literally only wear suits for weddings, or like if I had a very high profile client, I don't even think I'd wear a suit, but like it's kind of a shifted paradigm. But yeah, I wanted to do a bunch of jobs. First job I wanted to do was I think a photographer, like some sort of reporter, and that was like I was 10, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, so I made a lot of.
Do you do any photography today?
No, I work with photographers, but I can't take pictures for. They're not worth a damn. And but no, and then I think I did. Really, I think the job that I discovered, as abstract that it was really consulting. I started understanding it. I thought consulting was as abstract as what you actually do can be. The idea of coming in and coming out, like not necessarily being an employee and fixing something and working on, a very strategic problem if you're a prominent consultant, depending on which scale you work. I like that idea. I like the idea of fixing a problem. I think that was like the premises of whatever it is that I do in my life. That's what I wanted to do.
Right. So for the purpose of those on the call today, on the participating, can you give us the one-liner or the short summary of what is FuckUp Nights all about? This event that you organize.
Yeah. FuckUp Night is the center topic of FuckUp Night is failure, obviously, as this name kind of includes. It's a meetup where you have 3 or 4 speakers that come and share a professional failure. And according to the format, using 10 images that, since traditionally, basically, to make it easy on the speaker and to focus on the story, you would only be required to have images on your slides. So 10 slides, 10 images. And to make it even easier, they would transition every 40 seconds. So you just tell your story and everything just, the slideshow just goes through it automatically.
Yeah. So
that means that your story would last 6 minutes or 40 seconds, which we rounded up to 7 minutes. Over time, a lot of things change. Speakers are not, that level of being prepared so that they can sync an automatic slideshow with their story and still being engaging. So the clicker came. So let's say it's roughly between 7 minutes and 10 minutes, but there's always 3 or 4 speakers. Doesn't matter which craft or which industry they're from, or if they're a business owner or an employee, they just come and share a failure and how they learn, what they learned from it. That's the goal of the event.
Right. And before you discovered this event, were you already on to this topic of failure? Was it something that you were curious about and bouncing around?
Well, I mean, my job was originally to be basically a marketing consultant for SMEs and startups. So obviously, you when you work at that level, and it's not corporate clients or governments or big, let's say big clients, it's all you see. You only see failures. You come in because there's a problem. You come in because the website wasn't working, or the developer took the money and ran, or because there's a rift between 2 partners.
Mm-hmm.
So you see things going wrong so much. And I'm the guy that would come into projects that had potential, but that were essentially operating in chaos. Right? Like the budgets, for example, that I'm discovering now, it's thanks to the track record of having worked with so many startups that had no budget, or that it kind of took me there. But failure was, for me, ubiquitous in entrepreneurship as a whole. It's like failing at things, or not succeeding, or not having something go your way, right? And I used to go to meetups. I had a lot of friends that were hosting, creative morning, startup weekends, those things, like those big events, whatever. And the one thing that always came out was that the entrepreneurs I was talking to, even though I was a consultant or was at least offering services to them, was that everything was going fine. Everything was okay. Everything was awesome. And at some point, people in those meetups were telling me, it's funny, everything is always awesome. The speaker's life are awesome. The business cases are awesome. Everyone is great, but somehow everyone is at a meetup to learn or to know, get something. They wish someone would do something about failure. So I stopped going to these events, and I kept the idea, or at least the soundbite, in my head until my business partner at the time saw an article in El País, or in the Spanish newspaper. I don't even speak Spanish. In the Spanish newspaper about a Mexican concept. So imagine you're in Geneva, you read a Spanish newspaper about a Mexican concept about failure. And the legend has it that, so I heard the name and I wanted to do a fuck up night, just on the premise. I thought it was simple, the mechanic was simple, the topic was non-conventional, and the name was, direct. So I kind of liked, it took me 6 months to decide to do one. That was in 2014. But I never really, it's not like as if I was selling or working or wrote a book about it. It really just, I always felt like hosting something one day.
Mm-hmm. How was the first event compared to the last event?
First event was super funny. We did it at right around the corner from where I am at Impact Hub Geneva, because since we knew the guys, we pitched them the idea, they liked it. We didn't really coin it or named it a fuck up night. It was kind of like an experiment. If the experiment was conclusive, we would do it again. It was supposed to start, I think, at 7 or 6:30. When it was 7, I think there were like 15, 20 people in the room.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, okay, well, and the Facebook event worked quite well. Like a lot of people said they were coming. We had great speakers. We had the founder of JobUp, so through networking, it was a solid lineup. But I was like, 15 people, really? Like you have to understand. When I was in college, I used to produce concerts and comedy shows and events. So I'm used to having 500, 600, 1,500 people in a room that paid for it. And then it was a free event and there was 15 people. So my ego was hurt. But then we did something you never really do, especially not in Zurich. We waited. So we waited 7:15, 7:20, 7:30, and people started arriving. And by the time it was, I think, 7:45, about 120 people were in the room.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just that there's a different culture of meetups, especially back then in Geneva. People were coming home from work and they just took their time to come. So then there was 120 people and it was memorable. It was to this day. I remember I met a guy a year ago. So 5 years later, he told me, oh, I think I've been to the first one. I was like, wow. And I still remember it, blah, blah, blah. Nice. And then the last one, I think it was most recently, I used to do one in Zurich. So I launched Zurich. So yeah, by the way, so that's a funny story, is that there's an urban legend that says that it's the ETH Entrepreneurial Club that launched the Fuck Up Night in Zurich.
Right.
Now, that is not true. It's absolutely not true. I know Zurich likes to fake things. No, it's a guy from Geneva. But what we did is that the first time we did Zurich, I knew ETH Entrepreneurial Club were doing so many events. I wrote to them on Facebook, and the former president answered saying, can you just share the event? We did it in Schiffbau district with Flux Laboratory. And a few months later, they came to see our Fuck Up Night, and then we started deciding to do them together.
Mm-hmm.
That's the real story. And then I gave them away the license. But every year I kept doing one with Stadtzentrum. We did one at the Plaza Club every December. Right. I think that was my last one. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was my last one before I quit. And it was awesome. Like it's funny because the deal we had with ETH was we could keep doing Fuck Up Nights, but we had to, the speakers had to speak Swiss Germans. Everything had to be in Swiss German. I was like, all right, that's much better because culturally it's more relevant to the audience. I could still host in English. I was like, all right, fair. And we didn't call it a Fuck Up Night. I think it was a Fuck Up Nach or something like that. I was like, yeah, it's Zurich. It's okay. So, it's kind of, but it's funny to me because people walk around and say, yeah, it's the club that did it. I was like, sure, it's the club that did it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the last one was fun, but I think I just got a little tired. You have to imagine, I started doing, most people, it's a city-based concept, city license. Most people take the license in their city. Mm-hmm. I took the license from my business partner at the time for Geneva, Lausanne, and Zurich, because we wanted it to be a business case for our consultancy of what we can do with a brand. So we figured, let's have a big business case. So that's unheard of. It's harder than people think, even for a small meetup, especially when you need to rely on the community for speakers, for venues. But I got really lucky. But yeah, that was the first Fuck Up Nights Switzerland, is having the ambition of doing it in so many different cities.
Mm-hmm. You know? Mm-hmm. Is there any so how do you see the difference between Geneva, so there's the famous Rüschligraben, the divide between the French side and the Swiss German side, when it comes to entrepreneurship, when it comes to especially the topic of tonight and the topic of failure?
Yeah. First of all, I think there's I could say there's two Röstigraben, ironically. There's one that starts, I think, right out before Bern, is it? Or Jura and Bern, and it's kind of like the traditional one between the French-speaking part and the German-speaking part. And that's two different, let's say, mindset on those topics. And then there's one that starts in Geneva and the rest of Switzerland. Why? Because we also have Lausanne. As in culturally or entrepreneurship-wise, Lausanne is kind of like, I shouldn't say that, but I will. It's kind of like the beacon of entrepreneurship in the French part, as in because they have a PFL, because they have a startup culture that's so much more developed. So in terms of entrepreneurship, I would say the French side is learning. It's less liquid or less, let's say, capital or private equity, less equity focused. That could be the German side is much more business focused, much more, I would say, scale driven. It's more about entrepreneurship here is like a lifestyle. It's like it's a hobby. It's something you do because you have an idea and it's a side hustle to your job. You do it because it's cool to say you have a business. That's the way I see it. And the German side, they take their stuff very seriously. They actually want to make money. They actually want to succeed. So their relationship to failure is that in their mind, if it exists, it's a bad thing because you're supposed to succeed to live from what you're doing. So in a way, it's not so much that the mindset is different, is that some people do entrepreneurship a little bit more relaxed. I think the French part, we do it a little bit more relaxed than the German part, where really people are trying to understand, to learn the best practices. I feel like they're more like I'm North American. I'm serious about everything I do in business. In the French part, we prefer the networking side of it, the status, you know. So failure is an option because failure is relative. We don't invest everything we have in what we do. It's like in finance, you put 20% in it. So if you fail, no one knows, because if someone knows about what you're doing or not, in the French part, sometimes that's okay.
Right.
That's okay because, well, I did it. My friends knew about it. I had an investor, which is your personal family money. In Zurich, I saw it completely more. I saw the angst, or let's say the urgency, the sense of urgency to succeed that you see in other European countries, which is you do it because you want it to be your job, not just because it's a side hustle. You know. So I would see it more from this perspective. I'm not saying it's for everyone. I know some very good entrepreneurs here, and I work with them. But with the other ones, like with some of them, it's more like they like the startup culture.
Right.
You know, they go to the meetups. Oh, but I don't have a project yet. I'll have a project in maybe next year. And I might do Mass Challenge. I'm like, why? Well, because, you know, they want to learn to be an entrepreneur. I would say that's the biggest difference.
Right. Interesting. And what would be some in over the years of hearing these different stories, both with the companies you're working with as well as through the events, what would be some advice that you would share to entrepreneurs today who are in the early stage of their entrepreneurial journey, related specifically to failure? I mean, of course, the first one is don't be afraid of it, but something more tangible or practical that you've seen here in Switzerland?
I think it's related to what I said before. The idea of learning to be an entrepreneur is to me laughable. As in, most people think they can mitigate the risk by taking all these classes, all these training, all these things, and you're like, you know what? Before you learn how to be an entrepreneur, kind of learn about what you're trying to make a business of. As in, learn about the industry, learn about what product, like as in you want to, for example, launch a restaurant. That's great. But if you never worked in the restaurant business, figure that part out first. Figure out how to make money from it. Figure what makes a good restaurant. What's a good chef? If it's an Italian restaurant, well, then go to Italy. Like I said, I think most people, they think that it's the hustle that makes the success. It's, if you take even developers, some people learn the code so that they could code what they had in mind. Some people went to coding school with the idea of launching a business, which are two completely different things. And I think most people miss that part, the part where people, like the time that you spend after work on weekends, reading, learning about what you're trying to do, especially in the digital side. So I think most people, it's not so much about being ready to fail, it's being ready to be irrelevant also. Because even if you have a great project, your biggest problem is no one knows you.
Right.
As in, It's not just about coming up with the perfect service or project. It's that, yes, no one knows about you. Having a website is not an ends to a mean. You're going to have to invest or put time into being known, which is what we've done with FuckUp Night. Before becoming the platform of failure, we wanted to prove that we would walk the walk, as in that you don't have to give me money for me to have an impact, for me to have media coverage, for me to engage crowds, for me to connect with high profile speakers or not. It's more about hustle and organization and a good plan, strong branding. It's like we understood the fundamentals, even if it's experimental. I think most people don't do that grind. They automatically go to production. They have that trader's mindset. I have this product, so I will naturally find a market. No, sometimes I have a product. There's a reason why it wasn't here, because there were regulations. There were financial obstacles you didn't know about. There's maybe the market's not ready for it. But no one cares about that. Everyone does a market study. If you talk to any entrepreneur, I did a market survey. What did you do? Oh, I asked my friends. Sure, but your friends might not be your customers. They will follow your business, but are they going to give you money for what you want? No. So they're not your customers. So you didn't do a market study. And those are the things for me, the premises, the vision in a vision, that are the biggest failure factor. Even in the corporate world, they have money, right? So they have money. They'll throw money at a problem saying, yeah, well, we are, for example, Nestle, and it'll work, or Procter or PMI. Their biggest failures is that they throw millions in the dark on the false good idea sometimes. And then they're like, oh, we lost all that money. But hey, it's okay. In our P&L, we're still making profits. So no one heard about that failure. But the employees, they're the one who are in it. And they're like, wow, we lost all that money for nothing. I think that's the thing that I've seen the most is error of judgment. It's not even so much technical ability. That you can find a co-founder, you can find resources now. Everything can be externalized. That's great. You can have a great branding. It's just that when it comes to the business, no matter how digitalized it is or not, most people have too many assumptions. Way too many assumptions.
Right. Yeah. I just wanted to announce to everyone watching that if you have a question, please go ahead and type it into the chat, and we'll accommodate as well. But the whole idea really is to get questions from you, the audience, as well. So if anyone has a question, just type it into the chat, and we'll rope that in as well.
Yep.
With the speakers that you've had in your events, did you have a difficult time in convincing people to speak, or in finding founders who are willing to talk about their failures?
I had a firm policy about speaker selection, which was if someone isn't sure about participating, I either wouldn't insist or I wouldn't ask them. For example, if someone had a problem with the name, I wouldn't ask them, because it tells you much more ideological or philosophical problems that they have with the very notion of speaking about failure.
Right.
So if my speaker has a problem with that, what usually happens if I push them to it, then they would make some sort of weird talk about how failure doesn't exist, or, oh, but I don't see failure in my life. Yes, there are failures in your life, and that's fine. But if you have a problem telling that, you go against the very premise, which is we want to de-dramatize it, or we want to show that you learn from it. But most people, they block with the name. So in that sense, that was my first rule. If you have a problem with it, I'm not even going to consider you.
Yeah.
But then some people, they really feel the need to participate, but then they have to come up with the story, or at least they want to tell the story a way where they don't basically kind of slander other people or reveal things that are too. It's still a communication exercise. So reveal to them is too, let's say, sensitive. So I would spend time with them, kind of building up the story.
Okay.
But convincing them, no, to be honest, FuckUp Night reached a point where, let's say in the entrepreneurial community, it was so well known, I could just point someone, point a brand, point a company, point a person, and be like, hey, I'd love to have you. And the platform was so big, there were so many opportunities that they would always find the time to come. Mm-hmm. I had speakers that came at least 3 or 4 times, just for fun, with a different story, with different whatever. So no, and also benefited from the community support and the media support. It was so visible at some point, like especially between 2015 and let's say 18, that people would come to me saying, hey, I have a story. I was like, all right. It's not as if I became so identified with the idea of sharing that I was happening even when I was a social gathering, they would be like, "Hey, Reg, I wanted to tell you, I know someone that would tell a story." I'm like, "Listen, like, I don't hope for the people around me to have stories to tell. Hope in an ideal world, no one has. Everyone deals with it, and they don't need FuckUp Night to deal with it. But yeah, speaker selection became easier and easier. And also, since I was partnering up with all these other venues, institutions, associations, or whatever, they were sourcing from their community. So there was many events where I literally just had to show up. They knew how to brief them. They knew they kind of submitted just a profile. I was like, yeah, sure, no problem. I'm not picky. I would show up and do the job. So it's actually pretty easy the way I streamlined it in a way.
And one question I had, though, maybe a little bit, maybe sensitive or not. I only attended the events here in Zurich. And some of the events or some of the speakers that were here was a little bit along the lines of what you were saying, your typical Swiss story of failure that made it sound, you were trying to find the failure in the story. And there's several times that there were speakers up there and they had their speech, and I was like, what is the lesson, or what are you trying to share with us?
So there's it's not sensitive. It's a matter of, for me, it's I would say logistical problem, organizational problem, and then in reality, it's also how it's produced. So pre 2017, when I was still part of the organization, Entrepreneurial, my partners were taking care of everything. There was free burgers, free food, drinks, venues. I just had to show up, really. So I was giving them a lot of leeway to pick the speakers. And the way they were pitching, even by email, the way they were pitching how to do the exercise was so free and wide that the speakers were like, okay, I'll tell the stories the way I want, when really we have a red tape. So we have a red tape of like 5 points to address. If you at least show them this, well, then they will know how to build up their story. So there were even times where sometimes in Zurich, I was watching some edition. I was like, what are you saying? And it comes down to how they were briefed. Now, the organizational problem is I was so far, and also the communication with the partners was so sketchy that even when I tell them, listen, give me the names of the speakers so I can at least send them a briefing, because I had like a whole briefing package, like an email with a speaker guide that I would send them to make sure that they read it. So at least this way that doesn't happen. It was so opaque in a way, like not very transparent, that I was like, okay, you know what? They give us big platforms. Every time I was going to Zurich, we went from like 60 people to 400 when I was leaving. And then it became like 1,500, 1,000. But it comes down to prepping. And one thing I learned being hosting a lot of events in the German part, and I started in the French part, mostly in the German part, is that the speaker is kind of a king. It's like you don't tell the speaker anything. You're like, oh, you're so happy he's there. Oh, I'm happy you're coming, and this and that. When I used to go and have speaking engagement, for example, hosting engagement, and I used to ask producers for guidelines, like I got many guidelines just for you guys, and it was very there on that time, do this, do that. You guys are very hands-on. They were surprised. They were like, oh, thank you for asking. I'm like, well, I mean, it's your event. Like, you're supposed to be the one to tell me how I package my story, if my story is good or not. Because in the corporate FuckUp Nights, which is a business that no one sees, like the private FuckUp Nights, that's a service we offer to companies. We train the speakers. Like I spend time with them, an hour, help them build a presentation. So the rendition that people saw, sometimes even I was frustrated, because at the end of every event, I would go see like the host and be like, guys, we need to do this, this, this. And in their mind, it's like, listen, the venue was packed. People were happy because, they're laughing or you made it work. But in my mind, I was like, okay, but what they're going to remember from it is much more the name of the event than what they actually heard. And sometimes there were gems. Sometimes there were guys who automatically knew, like in the midst of 1 or 2 speakers or 4 speakers, there was 1 or 2 that knew exactly how to do it. They seen it and they did it well. But yeah, I agree. That's the part that kind of also, that's how when you relinquish kind of control to be able to do as many FuckUp Nights as I did.
How do you think that reflects on the culture? And so that sort of ties into my next question about how you see the culture changing over the last few years in relation to failure. I mean, I've seen personally, I've been involved 11 years now in the startup space here in Zurich. And in 2013, I organized FailCon, which is a different version. And we also had 100 and some people attending, and it was a really good event. And we also like you, put in the efforts to make sure that the stories were relevant, and the feedback was amazing. But it was, 2013. No one wanted to have their name linked to a conference on failure. This was just unheard of. And so over the years, I've seen that change, and improving. Also, the way entrepreneurs approach things. Before, you would wait 2-3 years, all this. By the time a startup launches, they have a board of directors in office, and it doesn't even look like a startup anymore. Nowadays, people are now taking sort of more you want to refer to across the pond, maybe the American, the UK approach. You have an idea, throw up a website, talk to some friends, see if it works. If it doesn't, you pivot and all of that. So things are changing. It's not there yet. There's a long ways to go here in Switzerland from the culture. But in your experience, also in talking in the media and in pushing this topic and making it more normal to address failure.
I think it's what changed really is that it became like an acceptable topic, and even became trendy. As in, what I was telling you about people remembering much more the name of the event than the actual content, that's on the organizer. But the fact that there's an event on failure, most people are like, they accepted the very existence. For them, it's like it's necessary, regardless of what the content is, it's necessary to have it. Media's, for a long time, they were pushing the fact that the initiative was worth pushing, and that its mindset was innovative in itself, or at least was necessary. But you even had entrepreneurs, successful ones, that were like, okay, you know what? I'd love to come. It kind of became like participating to a TEDx. They were like, you know what? It would be cool to have like the medal of honor of having been invited to it. Cool. In terms of mindset, I would say that I think we still evaluate startups or entrepreneurs or businesses with the wrong metrics. As in, if someone failed at something, I'm not saying that we dismiss them, but I think people don't understand how intricate a failure can be. How a failure isn't necessarily financial every time. How some companies were working well, and when I mentioned before, a rift between partners, two founders that get in an argument, maybe because they were married or whatever, is sometimes more damaging to a business than the business actually not working. Is it a failure? I don't know, but maybe the result is that the company dies when it was going well. So in a way, most people, they don't look, I think, more incisively in the ramification of a business to fail, but they do accept that it exists. I think it's not as, when people pitch themselves now, a lot of people are starting to pitch themselves by saying all the things that they failed to get to the business that they're doing now. And they do it in a rather, I would say, laughable way or funny way, because for them, it's behind them, and it's what brought them to that success. So in a way, that's good. A lot of high-level speakers, they're like, yeah, like, I'm tired of saying everything I've done, I sold my companies, I did this. No, they want to say, I had a lot of hardship, but it took me to my passion or whatever I'm passionate about. But that being said, it does feel like, I wouldn't say that the cultural mindset on failure changed, because we're a risk-averse country. Like, the day banks start telling us, you know what, we're giving away grants and money or loans to entrepreneurs the first year, sure. Then we could say they're not scared of them failing, because the first 5 years or 3 years, they're a risk. And with the day state starts announcing how private investments have raised and increased, considering there's negative interest rates in bank accounts, sure. And they invest in private equity or in businesses, yeah. That day I would tell you, they're not afraid of it failing or of past failures. But for now, our entire society is based on, how do we mitigate the risk of an investment? And until that changes, until that culture changes, I can only say, from a pure pop culture standpoint in Switzerland, yeah, I think we made strides. I think now, like, you see conferences where one of the topics, or the end of the day topics, will be something on failure, roundtable. That you see the shift. They think it's a necessary topic,
Yeah. I mean, culture is, it's something that's deeply ingrained, and it takes a long time to shift away from that. It's one thing to talk about; it's another thing to act. But at least the first steps are being made, and I think the conference that I held in 2013 and the efforts that you've had with all the events have impacted the ecosystem in a significant way. And it is you do have a different sense of the reaction that most people have. And even from the investor side, there is a significant increase in the investor amounts that are happening in recent years.
And I think what changed is that investors now are looking for proven entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs they've been through the game before. So that means if it worked or didn't, that's almost irrelevant. It's more about, okay, so you funded before, you had employees before. It's not just something that's coming out of your head, So in this sense, I think that investors they're more open also to digital, which they weren't. They used to love, med tech or life tech backed startups, fintech backed startup, but now they're like, okay, we'll broaden a little bit of our horizons. And I think that's good, but I also think that it also raises the challenge of having entrepreneurs who try to understand what's expected of them if they want to go in the fundraising game. Because in the end, it's a fundraising game. The real startup culture is about growing as fast as you can. So, which means you need external funds, And I saw a comment in the chat from Jan saying, in the end, it's a storytelling event. Well, now, if it really was, then I failed my mission. As in, if it really was a storytelling event, me working on storytelling, for example, for corporates and companies, me being a media officer, like at the high level for the Swiss television, I failed because I never actually worked on the storytelling of my speakers, in the sense that if it really was, it would have been like TEDx. I would have prepped them for 2 months. Some of them, I would have done so much work with them to make sure that what they say matters to the audience. But I realized that in the end, since the failure is very personal, it is about storytelling, but it's more about the story. So in the end, I had to make sure that they felt comfortable enough to share something with their own words that they may have not even dealt with. It's I remember having, like, among my guests there were other organizers, and they were saying it's funny because in the end it's a platform where the red tape is simple enough for anyone to be able to do it. But if it were really up to me, I had 3 criteria. The first criteria was to have a good failure story, like a story that's, it's relevant no matter who you are. To have a high profile speaker, someone that you know about, but mostly from his background, his positive background, and you wouldn't expect that story from him. Or to have a top brand, a brand that's recognizable, and you wouldn't expect a failure story linked to that brand. Right. Ideally, you have all 3. But I had 350 speakers in 5 years, over 350 speakers. I wouldn't even say the 350 of them were professional speakers. I would say a good maybe 10% of them were. So in a way, yeah, it's a comms exercise, but where you have to be honest, or at least you have to try to be authentic. The minute it doesn't work, it's because the way you did it, you try to do it as you try to spin the story.
Right. Basically. But I think to your point, if the story is authentic, and that there's one speaker here in Zurich that really stood out to me. I don't know if it was, it wasn't the last one. I think I was at the theater thing, but before that was at the, what's it called, in Orlikon. And that one had a very peculiar mix of speakers. But there was one woman who basically, I think the night before, had gotten off the plane from San Francisco and had, just maybe not that short, but really in the last week or so had shut down her company that had grown to multiple offices. And, part of the time she was in tears, telling her story authentically about, she tried everything she could to make it work, and it didn't work. And she gave the reasons, and no amount of preparation and pitch talk, all that would
you can't get that.
You can't, and so when you have it, where as opposed to some of the other speakers we had that night, where I was just searching for any thread of relevance to the event, that saved the event for me. But it was also really interesting to hear that this person was willing to stand up in front of 1,500 people and share this very intimate story.
It's when I started FuckUp Night, I told myself my job as a host is very peculiar. My job is to make everyone comfortable. As a host, I remember Zurich taught me a lot about the job, because in Zurich, I wasn't accustomed with one thing with Swiss German audiences is that they don't give you anything at the beginning. Like as in at the very beginning, the first, I would say a good 15, 20 minutes, they don't give you anything. They're just there and they're curious. They're listening. They're very concentrated. That's not the problem. Is that emotionally you want to connect with them. And I figured my job is to make everyone comfortable with what's going to come up next, either for the speakers or for the audience, because most times I didn't even know what they were going to talk about. I never really asked. That was my decision. But this makes that if you're going to have a moment like this, you may as well just, walk people through the process of what could happen. So that if it was a funny moment, great. If it was a sad moment, even better. So in that regard, I think I just accepted or understood that how you deal with your failure when you're talking to some strangers in front of you, at that moment, you cannot make that up. However, when someone would, for example, pitch me their story beforehand and tell me, you think I should say that, based on their personality or maybe even the relevance to the story, sometimes I would tell them, don't say it. Because something sounds really nice. If we're talking to two of us and you're telling me a story, it sounds super nice because it's just you and I, and you feel like no one else is hearing, even though we have an audience. But the minute there's like even 50 people in front of you, and then you think it through in your head, that moment you want to drop that information, you're like, whoa, okay, wait, I'm going to say something super personal. And that's where you break down. Then sometimes you lose the thread of what you were saying, and then you go from 7 minutes to 20 minutes. So I think that took its toll on me over time. It took its toll on just all the stories you hear, all the things you hear, and also the relationship you build afterwards with the speakers. Because no matter how you look at it, some of these speakers, I've never seen them again, but they remember me as a guy that gave them a platform to share that story in front of strangers or in the media or streamed on the web, right? Yeah. So it makes for a very personal relationship. And I saw in the chat, Udo's asking if I could outline one or two of my favorite stories. Now, the problem with that is that I think when I ended, I was at 120 FuckUp Nights, private and public. And at some point, I think I came to a point in my life when a FuckUp Night was done, I would try to forget everything that would happen. Before, during, and after, all the interaction, just to clear my mind. But there were some moments where, for example, I can't even say favorite, because favorite means it was like a movie. There's some stories that were completely crazy, and it was like a movie where you were listening for 7 minutes. But some of my favorite stories were, for example, I remember a friend of mine was explaining how he took over an agency, and he became a friend afterwards. He took over an agency, and everything went down when his father died. So his father dying is not a failure, but he wanted to link what happened in that agency, or how he left, or how he got fired, or whatever, to probably a reason not even his employer knew. Probably like no one knew, and no one knew about it. He never spoke about the death of his father. And I remember to this day, this guy is very, very well, for example, immersed in the co-working community. Like some here might even know him, and he became kind of like my sponsor, like my godfather in Lausanne, opening all doors because of that platform he had to share that story. So that was a moment in a friendship that to this day I still remember. But then there were stories, for example, there was stories where some people lost over $1 million. One of my favorite stories was I think the second speaker we ever had at FuckUp Night, and the first FuckUp Night, so 5 years ago. We had a VC called, I think his name was Bernino Lind, very well connected, from Austria, and he did all these things. And when you see him, he seems like a very brash individual. And I thought he was a very brash individual. He gave a talk where he explained that he lost everything. I'm saying divorced, he became an alcoholic, gained weight, lost 1.2 million of all his friends and families and fool's money. He lost everything, made it back. And he explained the value of all these experiences in the midst of all this, right? And so it was a great talk. I was blown away. And I remember he wrote to us an email afterwards. And the email was saying, listen, guys, I got an email from one of the participants saying, the first time I saw you, I thought you were arrogant. I thought you were brash. I thought you were rude. I really didn't like you. And then I saw you at FuckUp Night, and I realized that you were an incredible person. And thank you for that. And he told me, just for this, I'll be forever thankful for you guys for giving me the opportunity to do this. Right. And those are like the moments where you're like, okay, you start realizing that the things that you do matter. The thing that you organize as an organizer matter to some people that sometimes you might not even meet. There's some people that I've met that told me, listen, I saw you at FuckUp Nights, and then the next day I launched my company. Those are stories that are after FuckUp Night, after the event, that people told me. And in my mind, I just do my job and go home.
Mm-hmm.
Like I wouldn't even connect to the idea that the thousands of people that came across, willingly or unwillingly, would have an impact somehow in their work life, in their personal life, based on attending the event. So there's a lot of stories, and they're not even necessarily on stage. It's just the interactions with the
Of
people.
course. And on your side personally, is there, did you ever give your own personal fuck up story on stage?
Yeah. So you have a fuck upper. So an organizer is called a fuck upper, right, in the community. And when you have, for example, the logistic problems, the speaker don't show up, or like leaves you hanging, you're supposed to go on stage. So you're supposed to go tell a story. You're the backup guy. So I did it, I think, 4 times, sharing a story. I shared different stories. But then when you do the private fuck up nights, so for corporates that I started doing in 2017, sometimes also you're required to give a talk or share on stage. And I remember something is that when I did it myself, I think I never quite understood the experience as much as when I had to give a talk for 7 minutes. Firstly, because 7 minutes is, depending on how you look at it, 7 minutes is either super long or super short. It really depends how you look at it. And also, me, for example, personally, it drew me back into the period I was explaining. Like the context that I was describing, it takes you emotionally back. So it took me as a speaker, it really kind of also taught me how to keep a certain distance in what you think you have distance until you are emotionally, everything becomes emotionally charged.
Right.
Yeah. So I think I gave my personal story, I think, about 5 or 6 times during these events. And as a host or a private host, I gave about maybe 5 or 6 talk on failure from my perspective. And I think I recommend the experience in the sense that no matter the name of the event, it challenges you to put yourself in the center of the story. There's some stories you tell, when you really listen through, it's a comms exercise. Everyone failed and I was in the middle of it, but it's not really me. It's laws, it's money, it's my partner, it's my employee. But Fuck Up Nights tells you, okay, same story, but then it's a you story. So how did you live this, or what did you do in this? So doing this is completely different storytelling. Just it's a fundamentally different perspective on something you think you dealt with until you start saying it from your perspective. It's like a video game. It's like first person shooter. So all of a sudden you're the actor. You're not just a bystander saying, "Oh my God, this fuck up happened before me." No. You're the one with the repercussions. You're the one that have to explain what you did wrong.
Yeah.
So that can be pretty intense. I have to admit.
And is there like one story maybe of on your side, a business challenge or business failure, or
I have so many. You have no idea. Like I did fuck up night because personally I could do at least one fuck up night a month with 3 stories or 4 easily. Like as in, because as Jan said, it's a storytelling exercise. So if you know your storytelling, you take any failure, you have 7 minutes, go for it. My biggest one that I tell a lot is I remember when I had this big project in Canada. I'm a product owner, so basically I project manager in tech, and I had this huge project that came in. It was 40,000 francs, which for some is small. For me, it was really big at the time. I outsourced it to a team in Geneva, and my client was in Canada. So that's the first problem. But what I didn't know is that the day of delivery, we were supposed to develop an app, basically iOS and Android. My developer was an Android developer, and he was supposed to find an iOS developer. And I found out he didn't the day of delivery.
right?
Now, there's a lot of ramifications to why I found that at that moment, but either way, the result was that. And the ensuing problem was that the developer, for multiple reasons, sat on the code. Like didn't want to release the code that he had because he thought he wasn't going to get paid, even though I paid him 50% of what he was owed before, but whatever. And then the client got tired after 4 months of waiting. And then who was holding the contract? I was. So all of a sudden, it doesn't matter who you outsource to, who this, who that. and the client was expecting the prototype to show it to some potential clients, so there was potential damages, but I was the one signing. And that was in 2017. It's a problem that's still kind of active today. It's settled, but still today I still feel the impact. But these are the things where 2017, by then I was in digital and tech for at least 7-8 years. So I was accustomed. I worked with developers around the world. So I kind of went in saying, okay, it's a big budget, but I can make it work. But then when you have these types of problems, legal problems, wow. Like, it's not even about dealing with a lawyer that's in Canada, a different law framework, or whatever. That's not the problem. It's really emotionally how you have to, in the midst of that failure, I ended up in some project of launching a digital lab in PropTech in Geneva. Exactly at the right moment, this was happening. Partners are saying, oh, we want to invest in your idea. So what idea? I pitched them while I was drinking coffee with my business partner at the time. And it was just a one-liner pitch. And it was like, can you elaborate on that? And then 2 days later, we were starting whilst I was dealing with this. He didn't even know about the story. So you see how sometimes things evolve away where you're failing at something, but then you might be succeeding or materializing something else. Dealing with that emotionally was really, it's like schizophrenia. It's a mix of it hurts your pride and self-esteem, but in another way, it gives you perspective. But in another way, it's a very real financial problem. Yeah, that was
For sure.
That was a startup life.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. When do you have experience, or what advice would you have to founders who are looking to raise funds? Angel investment or fools, family, and friends versus bootstrapping.
Yeah, this morning, I was talking with a VC and deal with a lot of funds and accelerators, incubators for the last 4 years, primarily because they love content. So they love events, speakers, and community builders, but also because a big part of what I do also is linked to working on the pitch of these startups. And one thing I could say to anyone who has an idea that they're thinking about how they're going to fund it, prior to connecting to the private equity world, startup world, really, I think in 2016, I worked with startups or SMEs for at least 10 years that were not looking for that kind of funding. Why? Because to me, it fundamentally challenges you to make money, or at least to materialize what could be valuable in your company. My biggest advice would be, unless you have an asset or something that you're unless you need infrastructure, like, I don't know, like a factory, or this specific data scientist that does that, or this specific patent that you need to drop. If you can prototype it and if you can launch it, even with an MVP, and by bootstrapping it, and at best families and friends, I'm talking not families and friends, I'm talking business family and business friends. Okay, bootstrap. It's not so much because it's not the startup way, but it's more about then you're even more eligible for funds. Business angels, they have their process, even though it's more accessible than VCs. VCs are not even entering the conversation until a long time, until you at least have something to show for and some metrics and data. But I would say the challenge of asking yourself, is my idea a gimmick or a tool, or is it a business, starts when you're actually in charge of your money. And it gets worse when you have other people's money. Because actually starting with other people's money, depending also on the investors you accept, some investors, either they know what they're doing, either they don't, but the oversight they will require is based on your experience. If you're inexperienced in what you're trying to build here, well, then you're going to have an oversight in investor relations. You're going to have an oversight and relations that are so overwhelming, depending on what you're doing. You want to do it on your own first, because your vision maybe requires you to take decisions or risks that your investor that are not in their interests, but now you have to protect their interests. So for me, my job, I'm a marketer. So when I work with startups, my goal is to get them to market, regardless of whether it's the idea, the prototype, the product. So I always have to make it stick regardless of resources. So in that sense, anyone who wants to fundraise needs to be properly advised, has to have a proper structure. Like, it's better to join an accelerator. It's better to have a mentor, an advisor, that have all these people also that know the game, because it is not a startup game, it's a financial one. Like, it's literally a different organization. It's a different way of working. And your team also, it's not the same team, because productivity becomes an issue. milestones become an issue. So I think it's more about, it's what I was saying before, educating yourself on what it entails to fundraise, because it really doesn't matter what type of fundraising it is. Most people think it's free money. Once you have the money, okay, it's your money. No, it's not. Because then maybe it's like 100,000, maybe it's 20, 20, 20 every 3 months. And maybe with those 20, you're supposed to say what you're doing with them. You're not paying yourself with those 20. You're paying whatever it is that you said that you were going to pay with. And most people, when they discover that, they're like, well, why am I taking funds? I'm like, well, because you don't want to put your own money. So it's really more, I think the cost of money, of external money in a startup idea, most people think they know, but the people who know, well, they're developers. It's literally their time they're paying for. When they're not, and it's a technical idea, well, you'll need a developer. Right. And he's not going to work for free. And if he doesn't work for free, that means he's not your co-founder. That means you have an entirely different problem, because you could have saved money if he was your co-founder. So what does it say about your vision or your product? So it's I would say avoiding it at all costs, and then getting it once you know what you bring in the balance, what the leverage you bring to your investor. You know.
Mm-hmm. Do you see the question from Antoine?
Have you experienced with startup financing with established firms in their industry? Wait, let me see. Let me read that. Have you had experience with startup financing with established firms? Oh, you mean like corporate financing, or let's say corporates investing in startup? Is that it? Or like entrepreneurship? It's really popular now. It's really, really popular. Companies like Migros, La Mobilière. Good friends of mine work for La Mobilière. They launched To You. It's basically your digital vault, your last will, like in the digital vault. And that's actually that was incubated by La Mobilière. They're at EPFL. And what's great about it is that corporates can come in at different moments. And normally what's great about entrepreneurship is that in an ideal world, it fixes a problem when you know the solution is going to be used and you know you're going to have access to clients or users. So some companies do it better than others, but I realize that it's a bigger game than it seems, because you can't just go into a company, I guess, well, unless the job is open, saying, hey, I want to go work for you guys, but I want to do it in your corporate, because sometimes the lab or the infrastructure doesn't exist. But Swisscom does it. A lot of big companies are starting to do it. Migros does it. And they have some cool startups that come out of it, and it gives you resources that you wouldn't have on your own. And also there's another play that people don't see, is that's what a lot of accelerators do, is that they introduce you to the corporates once your product is ready. So that means you're working with them and they're using your product as either a use case or like they can even fund a part of your production. I work with a lot of startups that did this in my time in an accelerator in Geneva and afterwards. I think it's smart. I think it's smart to scale, or at least to have insights from your actual users or your, let's say, industry insights. But it's not necessarily applicable to everything. The food business does it a lot. FinTech does it a lot. Insurance, they do it a lot. I think it's just, it gives you a bit more comfort, but at the same time, depending on the companies, they're like VCs. Like they expect real results within 1, 3, 5 years. But I think it's a great way of the market. It's kind of arriving. It's huge in Germany, in France, in England, and it's arriving in Switzerland, really, I think, for the last 3, 4 years. And I think that's something that, for someone who's not sure about leaving the corporate world but still doing a bit of a startup, I think that's a great alternative.
So we're coming to the end of this session here and our questions. I don't know if anyone else in the audience has any questions for Reggie related to funding or startups or failure. And I was wondering if there is, just on while we wait to see if anyone has any questions. What about exit strategies?
Well, exit strategies.
I always say, just referring back to what you had said, as soon as you take someone else's money, you need to start thinking about an exit strategy.
Yeah. I'm going to share with you a story, which is so as I told you, started working with startups about 14 years ago, or companies. And I started working in digital about 10 years ago. I joined a small agency. We were doing websites and, like basic stuff. It was the golden era of Joomla, right before WordPress, Drupal, all those things. WordPress was coming up. And my boss / business partner at the time, he was up and coming. I met him. We were at uni. Everyone in Geneva was like, who's that guy? He was Dutch. Anyone who's familiar with the Dutch people, they're quite direct. They're quite, single-minded in what they do, especially in business. And I remember he was the guy that would come to school in a suit with his backpack and his computer in his backpack because he had meetings and he thought the clients take you more seriously, even if it's a small client, if you have a suit on. So no one believed in him. When I took over the sales of his small agency, we were like a team of 5. 2 months in, it was already failing. So that's one of my biggest failures, but it became now my consulting firm. And he left for London. In 2013, he launched a company that was basically specializing in kid tech technologies. So anything that was any companies that was focusing on communicating and selling to kids under 13, their company was building the backbone to do proper compliant ready platforms, websites, apps for that target audience. So he was dealing with companies like Lego, YouTube, Disney, all the big editors, right? Co-founded it. There were 6 of them in 2013. So I met him 12 years ago. He launched that company in the midst of all the other things he'd done in 2013. They're exiting now. So when he left the company earlier this year, he thought he was going to miss the IPO because there were so many companies have invested since. We're talking like Microsoft Ventures, all these guys, like 15, 20 million, like every year, that the company grew in value. And he left to launch something else. He wasn't the CEO, he was a CPO. And he was telling me, what if I miss the exit? What if I miss the IPO and my place in history of the company where he was creating so much value was forgotten? And I told him, well, there's a chance that you might leave and that the company might not even get there because I don't think they valued you enough in the company. But that was my perspective, knowing his background. It took him 7 years, but now normally they're on the verge of selling for over, I think, for about 300 million pounds. Just like 150 employees, all this thing. But that is a story arc of 12 years. So that's my first, I would say, he was on the way to become my first unicorn. Maybe it'll be the next venture where I'm supposed to join him. But it was a 12 years story for a 7-year company. And for me, it's amazing because I've heard of exits, but now I've seen it, and I've seen it so closely. You have to imagine. He called me 2 months ago, telling me that they were about to be bought back. He was in his new company, and the buyers said, we did the due diligence, and since the idea of buying came when my friend was still at the company, they told everyone, if he doesn't come back, we're not making the sale. That was like a multi-layer proof of concept. Yeah. But that's one story out of the dozens of entrepreneurs I've met, talked to, worked with, collaborated with. So it's to show how it exists. And it's a guy that, he lived half his life here, like he studied here and everything. But it's so rare, even though now there's more and more stories like this, especially in Zurich, guys like a Get Your Guide, all these companies are coming up, but it's rare, and when it happens, you're like, okay. But I never pitched the exit to anyone, but you do have to visualize it, because when it happens, if you're shocked, that's how you get a bad deal. But it's hard to do everything you do now when you're grinding, visualizing these kinds of stories, Yeah.
Well, I mean, also from the perspective of, some people have the mentality or the passion that this is my baby, I'm going to take care of it until the day I die. And other founders and entrepreneurs have that, the concepts that, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, and then they want to pass it on and move on to something new. So there's different personalities when it comes to, in the startup world. And sometimes so a while back I was working on a project with mergers and acquisitions and talking to founders who have been through exits. And it can be difficult to see a corporate take your concept and chop it up into little pieces and, decide what they like and throw the rest out. And that's where that balance between, which path are you going to follow and which direction are you going to go with building your business?
I think it's if the end game is to be bought out, then it's a different mindset. You build differently when you're looking to get the numbers to exit. But for example, I fundamentally follow projects where people are trying to stay in the company. They're trying to grow the company and be the next, I wouldn't say the next Apple, but at least the next Skype, something, big enough so that when you are bought back, there's a strategic also logic to it. Because some mergers are just, there's the Facebook style where sometimes you just buy them to put them on the shelf. But then there's other visions of, let's say, acquisitions where you actually want to do something that requires that company.
Yeah.
You know, so I think it's also how you see yourself evolving in your own company if you want to go in the funding direction.
Yeah.
You know.
So to wrap up, I mean, I've already been asking a few questions, but we have a new series of questions that I like to call rapid fire questions. I don't know if you've heard of that before. The idea really is there's no right or wrong answer, and basically the first thing that comes to mind, just to quickly get through a series of short questions.
Sure.
So, what's one item that you own that you wouldn't sell?
Shit.
If there's nothing, it's also it doesn't have to be.
I think for now I can't think of one, but I would say maybe my computer.
All right. What's your most unusual skill?
Speaking.
What's more important, strength, speed, or stamina?
Stamina.
Which historical figure do you most admire?
My God.
Current, past?
Crap. I know there's an answer to that, but I would say, I don't know, Muhammad Ali.
What's your favorite season of the year?
Spring.
When was the last time that you tried something new?
I think last week.
And team or single founder?
Team.
Cats or dogs?
Dogs.
Beer or wine?
Beer. Wine. Forget it.
And the favorite app on your phone?
Shit, man, you have too many technical questions. It's hard. I would say Instagram.
What's something on your bucket list?
Traveling the world, like seeing every country in the world.
And if you could have the attributes of an animal, what would you choose? Which animal?
I would say flying, like being like a bird.
Nice.
The first question, like, what wouldn't I sell? I know there's an answer to it, but somehow the problem is me and material things I have a very weird relationship to it. So I think I would say everything in a way.
Yeah.
Maybe my glasses. I would say my glasses because I can't see shit for without them.
Yeah. Well, Reggie, thank you so much for being with us tonight and for everything that you shared with us and your honesty and candidness and it was really insightful and appreciate you taking the time for us.